Good evening and welcome to this year's Holocaust Memorial Day event of Manchester University in collaboration with Manchester Reform Synagogue. We have watched Jacob the Liar, the East German 1974 version by Frank Bayer as a live stream, and will now continue with the panel discussion. Before we start the panel discussion, just some brief housekeeping announcements in case you weren't there at the very start. We would like to invite all audience members to raise your questions throughout the discussion now. And you can do this by opening the Q&A window and typing your question into the Q&A box and clicking send. And your question will then go directly to the panelists. And we can then answer them live during the discussion. And we hope that in this way we can address as many questions as possible. Also, we will have a simultaneous interpretation for Blanche Kommerell's contributions, which will be in German, and the simultaneous translation will be in English. If you want to listen to the simultaneous English translation, then you will need the latest version of Zoom. So hopefully you can still get this now. You can activate this by looking at the bottom of your connection window where you will see the interpretation button. And if you click on English, you will then hear the simultaneous translation. My name is Cathy Gelbin, and we will now hear some words of welcome from Alex Zamelli, who is Professor of Jewish Thought and the co-director of the Center for Jewish Studies at Manchester University.
Hello, I'm extremely pleased to welcome everybody to this event, combining academic analysis with the screening of a film. The Center for Jewish Studies at Manchester University is one of originally 3, now 7 European centers of excellence in Jewish studies in Europe. It organizes public events, hosts a series of interfaith discussions, and has an ongoing program of commissioning contemporary artists in engaging them with selected Jewish objects held at Manchester and other university libraries. The research pursued by members of the Manchester Center for Jewish Studies varies from classical rabbinic literature to the Holocaust, to Jewish responses to atheism and evolution, to cosmopolitan studies, and many other topics. The Center for Jewish Studies has offered events engaging with film and discussing film, both Jewish and Israeli or on Jewish topics, under the title Screen and Talk. Today's screening and discussion is part of this year's Holocaust Memorial Day events at Manchester University. Next week, we'll see the center host the Bogdanov Holocaust Lectures, the annual ones, presented by Professor Marianne Kaplan of New York University this year. This will take place on Tuesday and Wednesday at 6 p.m. UK time by Zoom. It is a great pleasure for me to join the organizers of this event in welcoming everyone to tonight's discussion.
Thank you, Alex. We will now hear some words of welcome by Robin Ashworth-Steen, who is the principal rabbi at Manchester Reform Synagogue. Robin, over to you.
Thanks, Cathy. It's really wonderful to be with everyone, and I'm delighted that this month's Screen and Talk from the Centre for Jewish Studies is in collaboration with our synagogue, Manchester Reform Synagogue, and lovely to be on the same screen as a community member, Alex as well, although in a different role tonight. As Alex said, we're in the context of having just marked Holocaust Memorial Day, and I think that for us in the community, we're still processing the anti-Semitic attack that happened on our sister community in Texas a couple of weeks ago, and the attack on our synagogue at the end of last year when fascists Zoom bombed our Shabbat service online. And I can see a few people from our community who were there then are here now. We also saw our synagogue used as a location of the drama Ridley Road on the BBC, which I'm sure a lot of you will have seen. And our synagogue was used as the synagogue from the 1960s, which was attacked by fascists. The line for me between history and the present, fiction and reality, community and academia are all blurred. anti-Semitism is a lived reality for us in Manchester. And with the political conversations, such as those that have emerged overnight, the comments from Whoopi Goldberg's recent comments, we can see that the Shoah and the insidious, dangerous hate of anti-Semitism continues and needs addressing, as we are today. Films, art, and conversation are vital, and vital to have, which is why this is so unique within the Jewish community and alongside them, for education, for relationship building and activism, to help us connect, imagine, and emerge renewed and activated. So I'm really very grateful to Katya, to Cathy, to Jarl from our community for all of your time and energy, everyone who's made this possible for this unique and vital collaboration. I'm looking forward to the panel discussion.
Thank you, Robin. I now have the pleasure of introducing our panelists. Sander L. Gilman is a distinguished professor of the liberal arts and sciences, as well as a professor of psychiatry at Emory University. He is a cultural and literary historian and the author of well over 90 books on physical and racial stereotyping, disability, and Jewish culture, the major topics. These include his now standard books, Seeing the Insane, Jewish Self-Hatred, and his biography of Jacob the Liar's screenwriter, Jurek Becker, A Life in Five Worlds. Sabine Hake is professor and Texas Chair of German Literature and Culture in the Department of Germanic Studies at the University of Texas at Austin. She is a cultural historian who has worked on 19th and 20th century Germany, and she has authored a series of standard studies on Weimar Germany, the cinematic representation of National Socialism, and German cinema. These include her titles German National Cinema, Popular Cinema of the Third Reich, and Screen Nazis, Cinema, History, and Democracy. And finally, Blanche Kommerell, the East German-born actor, director, and writer who shot to fame as Rosa Frankfurter in Frank Bayer's Jacob the Liar. She has appeared in numerous German cinema, TV, and theater productions and has taught acting and speech at several colleges and universities, including Berlin's University of the Arts, Humboldt University, and the Medical University Brandenburg, among others. She has been leading the student theater at private University Witten-Herdecke since 1990 and is a keen performer of literary events, including the works of Anna Akhmatova, Masha Kaleko, and Christa Wolf. In 2008, she was awarded the German Speech Prize of the Henning Kaufmann Foundation. Welcome to you all, and thanks for joining us on this panel today. I see that we already have some questions and in the Q&A, and again, please, everybody, you are very warmly invited to send in your questions. I'll maybe start off with a few. The story of Jacob the Liar is really a story of firsts, and the more I think about this film, the more extraordinary it becomes for me. It was probably, I think, the first post-war Holocaust comedy, to my knowledge, after Charlie Chaplin's and Ernst Lubitsch's iconic wartime comedies, The Great Dictator and To Be or Not to Be, respectively, which were made before full knowledge of the Holocaust emerged. And I'm particularly interested in the function of the fantastical and the comedic in this film. And again, the more I think about it, the more extraordinary I find it in this film. It was also the first and only East German film to be nominated for an Academy Award, which it wasn't successful at the time. And it was also, I think, the first and only East German film which was remade later on as a Hollywood picture. And also, it became the screenwriter, Jurek Becker's first novel. Many people think that the film is based on the novel, but actually the novel is based on his script for the film. And I hope that we'll be talking a bit more about the genesis of the film and how it sort of came into being in the collaboration between Jurek Becker and the director Frank Bayer. Which brings me to my first question, Sander Gilman. What inspired Jurek Becker to write the script and to work on this film with Frank Bayer?
Well, one has to start by saying that Jörg Becker was a child survivor. His family, when he was 5 years old, was incarcerated in the Łódź ghetto. At a point in the 1943, 1944, his father was sent to Auschwitz. He and his mother were sent to Ravensbrück. His mother died weeks before Ravensbrück was liberated. His father spent an enormous amount of time trying to track down his family. Ravensbrück was turned into a Red Cross hospital for survivors. And the child Jörg was found by his father. His father then made a decision, which is a really important one and a hard one to understand. He decided to stay in East Berlin, in East Germany, under Russian occupation, rather than going, as many Jews in the Russian zone did, to go ever further west. His father had the problems that all survivors had in coping. He became an alcoholic, and he told stories, true stories. He told stories. One of them was about his own bravery. He had a radio, he said, which is why he was sent from the Łódź ghetto to Auschwitz. Jörg Becker was an interesting kid. Because he was a survivor, he had advantages. He got into university. He didn't do really well at university. He was uncomfortable there, and they were uncomfortable with him. So they threw him out, and they gave him a choice. And this is where the film comes up. They gave him a choice after his third semester. You could either go work in the television factory. The university actually owned a television factory, or you can go and do an apprenticeship learning to write film and television scripts. Deva had a shortfall of people writing for them. So he began to write, and what he wrote was trivia. He wrote cabaret skits. He wrote the kind of East German boilerplate Marxist, Leninist films that were shown in the theater were shown on television. And then Prague happened. Jörg had been trying to write a story about his father, about surviving. And Cathy, you said a comic story. It was the story of reversal, not the man who had a radio, though as we saw in the film, there was someone who actually had a radio, but rather someone who did not have a radio, right? His father detested the idea that Jörg was going to write about him. The film script was eventually accepted. It was going to be made with Frank Bayer in Poland. And then the Poles did something that they'd never done before to the East Germans. They wanted a translation of the script. And now we're kind of in 2022. The Poles read the script and said, you don't want us to have a film filmed in Poland about a nameless ghetto in a nameless country, right? It sounds like you're going to say nasty things about Poland, and they canceled it. Jörg was so incensed about it that he sat down and transformed the second of these scripts that he wrote about Jacob into a novel. And the novel had difficulty getting published. It was published by the most important publisher, Aufbau, and then was reprinted by Luchterhand in West Germany and became a worldwide sensation. Within a year and a half, there were a dozen translations, at which point the East German authorities said, Deva said, maybe we should make a film out of the novel. So this is a very interesting film. It's a film that started out as a script that had a kind of standard ending with the Russian troops liberating, right? Liberating the ghetto. And it ends with a film with this extraordinary ending, this fairy tale ending, right? And it is Urich's retelling of the novel, which is a retelling in a film about his father who had a radio.
Thanks. Thank you, Sander, for introducing us to Ulrich Becker's life and work. Sabine, where would you place Bayer's film within the body of East German cinema more broadly, and what was called the GDR anti-fascist cinema?
Yeah, I think that is a very good question and will help us to understand the strange otherness of the film. With strange otherness, I mean in relation to the dominant paradigm, which is the Hollywood Holocaust film. And if you want to know specifically what I mean, I urge you to watch Jacob the Liar with Robin Williams. Well, for pedagogical reasons. I think what requires more historical textualization is that Jacob the Liar was also other within DEFA cinema. And so like as contemporary audiences now, we really have to do a little bit of digging to figure this all out. When I say otherness, I mean that the film refuses the standard things we expect. We expect character identification. We expect empathy, pathos, melodrama, but also moral uplift. We want some kind of message to go forward. And the film does nothing like it. And that makes it really, really disturbing. In order to fully understand it, how radical it was in the DEFA context, we must understand that unlike West German cinema, East German cinema from the beginning dealt with the Holocaust. If we just think, for instance, of the work of Konrad Wolf, who made Sterne, I think 1959, and a series of other films, including a play written by his father, Professor Mamlock, and of course, Ich war 19, I was 19, his own account of returning to Germany as a soldier in the Soviet army, which has a very interesting Sachsenhausen episode. So the predominant way of thinking about the Holocaust in the East German context was as being subordinated to the doctrine of anti-fascism. Meaning Nazism, from that perspective, was had to do with a kind of struggle with late capitalism. And the question of anti-Semitism had to be subordinated to the question of class struggle because it was a racial sub-question. Again, I urge you, if you want to know how that plays out, to look at a really fantastic film made by Frank Bayer of 1963, which is called Nackt unter Wölfen, or Naked Among Wolves, which is the story also based on a novel of the liberation of Buchenwald, but which focuses on a kind of communist resistance cell within the camp. That was the model how to think about anti-Semitism and the Holocaust in the GDR as part of anti-fascism. And I hope you agree with me when we conclude that in Jacob the Liar, this whole official doctrine has completely fallen by the wayside. So we cannot underestimate how much this is also a critique of the dominant narrative. Now, why did Bayer arrive at this point after having made really kind of more party-conformed films, say about the Spanish Civil War, Five Cartridges, I think it has to do with the fact that he made a very critical film, Spur der Steine, Trace of Stones, which was a critique of the economic system, and which was banned in 1966. And after that, Beyer was kind of sent through the cinematic form of Siberia when he had to make television films for over a decade. And in fact, Jacob the Liar was his first feature film after that. But I can imagine that people were not very pleased either, because the whole anti-fascist question was bracketed. And so I think for us today, what does the film do? It challenges us to question a lot of kind of viewing habits we have in relation to Holocaust films. It is quietly disturbing. I saw already people had issues with the 70s haircuts. Of course, even in Hollywood films, they have 70s haircuts in the concentration camps. I mean, partly it has to do with one aesthetic strategy. And I think one of you already mentioned it, the alienation effect, to not make it realistic, but to make it strange. The film does lots of other things too, and so perhaps we can talk about that. And so I'm going to leave it at that right now.
Thanks, and I'll probably get back to some of the things that Sandra and you have already said. Blanche, I'm interested in how you came to play the part of Rosa Frankfurter in the film.
How did you end up playing this role of Rosa Frankfurter? Well, I think it would take me a little while to answer that question, because I'm not Jewish, and in Jacob the Liar there were supposed to be only Jewish actors. But at 12, the age of 12, I read Anne Frank, and I more or less learned it off by heart. And since then, I had engaged with Jewish history, Jewish lives, Jewish people. And in East Germany, where I grew up in Berlin, I spoke to, I sort of acted as a speaker for Jewish girls in films. And then there was a casting, and there were probably others who tried out for the role, but I know that the casting was really wonderful, and I really enjoyed the casting, and I thought, this is the role that I want to play, and I got it. Great. And what were your first impressions when you arrived on set? Well, I guess the first thing that I saw, we shot in Moss, in this city that wasn't really inhabited anymore. And I thought that I'd gone back in time and thought I was back where I thought a ghetto must look like. And that's what I felt like as well. The feeling that I had was having arrived in a period in time which I was familiar with from everything I'd read about. And that was a very, very strong, these dark streets and these dilapidated buildings, this sort of stage set, the scenery was immediately alive in me. Everything that must have happened then, it really inspired me as well, made me identify more and more with my character.
When we spoke, you said that there was a special feeling that everybody had on set, that everybody could feel that there was something special about this whole situation of being there and making this film. What was that about?
When we first spoke, you were saying that really everyone who was involved in shooting this film said that it was a really, really special atmosphere. Could you say more about that? Yeah, I just finished studying to be an actor, and this was, I acted as a child maybe, but this was my first major role as an actor. And suddenly I was in this atmosphere, how do I explain it? Incredible enthusiasm for the script. It started with the costuming and with the makeup. Everyone had a feeling that they were doing something really, really good. Something good was happening. and this feeling that everyone was working on this one subject, something that they were all passionate about. That was something that I really felt, you know, the actors, my colleagues, but everyone, the technicians, everyone, even the camera operator, you know, as well. There was this mood, this atmosphere of, you know we are doing something that we all want to do. And that was amazing. Especially at the beginning, you know, at the beginning of my career as an actor. Yeah, or life as an actor. So it was a great kickoff to your career.
And what are your recollections of Frank Beyer and Jurek Becker on set?
What do you remember about Frank Beyer and Jurek Becker on the set? Because Jurek Becker was on set, wasn't he? Well, what I remember is that he seemed to always be there. I mean, it probably wasn't like that, but that's what I remember. He seemed to be always there. I'd read the book beforehand, of course, and I kept thinking, you know, Rosa's a completely different Rosa, not like me. You know, I mean, I saw it now. I just sort of had these chubby cheeks. I was so young, and then I asked Jurek Becker, I said, you know, I'm not the way you thought Rosa would be. And he said something that stayed with me throughout the entire screening. You are now my Rosa. And for me, that was this amazing statement. And then I was his Rosa. And when we were shooting the film, it was the case that, you know, we rehearsed really, really well, which I thought was a really good way of practicing the scenes. You know, we rehearsed the scenes and then you only needed 1 or 2 takes to shoot it and then it was finished. And then also we always had problems with getting enough film, so it was good to do 1 take and that was it. And that was a really wonderful way to work. And Frank Beyer, he let us sort of unfold. You know, just to tell you a little story, for example, when we were shooting in Jurek Becker's book, Rosa, after she, you know, settles in and isn't afraid anymore, you know, she's lying there naked. And I said, do I have to be naked? And Beyer said, do you want to wear a nightie or don't you want to wear a nightie? And I was allowed to say, I'd like to have a nightie. That would not be possible in today's world shooting films. You know, this kind of trust that Becker and Beyer both had in me that really strengthened me then. And I was a complete beginner. Thank you. That's a wonderful memory.
Wonderful memories that you have. We have some questions from the audience. And I think I'll just maybe put these to all of you and you can decide whether you want to take them up or not. We can take several responses as well, not just from one of you. Why was this film so sanitized? It could have been a Nazi propaganda film.
I don't quite get the word sanitized. I mean, Sabine said quite correctly, the strength of this film is that it wasn't pseudo-realistic. That's exactly why this film has the impact that it does. It's a film that suspends the realism, right? So sanitary, you know, and this is one of these problems because we have a kind of a fantasy about what the camps were, what they looked like, what they smelled like, right? That gets filtered primarily, by the way, which is an interesting phenomenon, through newsreels which were taken not in Poland, but at Dachau. The film clips that all of you have in your head, the bulldozer pushing bodies, for example, all of that. That's, in a sense, the set of images against which Jakob is written, because Jakob is about alive people functioning in a world where trust and belief exist and reality therefore has to be suspended.
Yeah, and if I could add to that. So first of all, no, I have watched about 500 Nazi propaganda films. I can promise you they function like Hollywood films of that time, meaning there is good and evil, there is stereotype, there is incredibly strong character identification, melodrama. And I think one of the aesthetic choices of this film is to prevent all of that, to not move towards the cliche that was already fully in place, not just in Hollywood, but also in the European films made about the Holocaust at that time, German, French, Italian. And so by preventing us from identifying with the characters and their suffering, we are kind of surrendered to a kind of open space. And I think the other question speaks to that too, the quiet. Again, the standard cliche of the soundtrack of your typical Holocaust film as noise, Nazis shouting orders, the sounds of feet moving, rushing towards the trains. And this film has an eerie quiet that is only emphasized by the fact that at key moments we have a very modernist tonal kind of score that is more noise than music. And again, the silence and the quiet, and also the kind of ability of the characters to have conversations is eerie. And I think that is very powerful because it goes so against the grain, of the rushed drama that is your standard Holocaust film.
I don't know, Blanche, do you want to add anything, or?
Would you like to add anything, Blanche? Yeah, I would. So I watched the film twice today. And in the process, I found myself looking at the question of humor in this film again, but also cruelty, and also the way in which the Germans are depicted. And I was thinking that there is an unaggressiveness in the film that comes across for me that I thought was good. And still, it was cruel enough. And I didn't need any more cruelty than that. I encouraged my students in Witten in Germany to watch the film, and they did. They watched the film. And part of the reason why I wanted them to watch it is because of the statement made about films in the German Democratic Republic, that you don't have to see everything black and white. So I'm afraid I only understand about half of what is said by the English-speaking participants, but that is something that's important for me to add. You know, many young people haven't got a clue anymore about those times. And to show them this, to show these young people, to talk about this, is something I think is really important. And so that's why I'm so glad that we're speaking this evening. Was that sort of in response to what the English-speaking colleagues were saying? Did it fit?
Perfect. It fits perfectly to what was said in English. I'd like to go back to this, to something I think that Sabine said about the film kind of going against the Hollywood Holocaust tropes that were already well established when Frank Bayer made the film. And I want to ask somewhat polemically whether one could read his Jacob the Liar as an anti-Anne Frank film, because of course the figure of the girl is a kind of Anne Frank figure. And there was the US TV film, by the way, on Anne Frank at the end of the 1950s, which is a very interesting film, but certainly the way in which the figure of Anne Frank was received, and possibly still is received, has often been a source of sentimentality. So I was wondering how you would read the film in relation to that trope in particular. All of you, maybe, not just Sabine. I'm just taking up something that's
I need to respond immediately because I have often taught the Anne Frank film, and perhaps some of you who have seen the film also as part of courses. Just imagine the scene where Anna and her friend are standing in front of the window in the roof, and there is an incredibly kitschy score in the background. And she basically says, people are good. We must believe that. And aside from the fact that even my students who are socialized into the Hollywood aesthetic find this unbearable, the kitsch, the saccharine kitsch factor. I think this would be perfect to juxtapose any discussion Jacob has either with the girl, with his friend, with anyone, where exactly that kind of, yes, people are basically good. This message is not being delivered. And that makes the film kind of radical in that regard. It does not go into that humanitarian discourse.
Yeah, but one also has to say that that is very purposeful. When Otto Frank edited the diary was edited exactly to make that point. It was not a diary about the Holocaust at all. When the film script was written, first of all, the play was written, and then the play was turned into a film. When we now read, of course, the diary itself, the unexpurged diary, which is just, in the last decade appeared, one realizes that that kitsch moment, first of all, isn't in the diary, which is quite striking. And second of all, it is an attempt after 1949, 1950, to kind of create this world in which everything works. I've been fascinated. Those of you who read the newspapers have noticed that mouse now has been banned in Tennessee. And then the question is, well, can we substitute something for mouse? And what is it they want to substitute? The expurgated Diary of Anne Frank, right? Which doesn't have any bad words and doesn't have any nudity. But the diary has lots of bad words and lots of preoccupation about sexuality and about being trapped and about dying, right? The unexpurged diary. So you're quite right. That's why I think Jacob is such a radical novel / film, because it really is a caesura in that kind of either Soviet, right? The world's going to be fine because the Soviet soldier has come and rescued the little girl. We all know Treptow, which is the way, by the way, the second draft of the film before the novel was going to end. Right? The little girl was going to be rescued by the Soviet soldier. Benigni does this, by the way, at the end of his crappy film, which, by the way, does get an Academy Award, which says something about what gets Academy Awards.
Blanche, I don't know if you wanted to.
Cathy, could you translate me for a little bit, because I didn't quite understand about Anne Frank, not so much. I would like to say something about the film Anne Frank. Well, we were talking about the contrasts in the film and the extent to which Bayer's film sort of is an intervention against sentimentality. Okay, then I did follow it correctly and I did understand it. Okay. In that case, I would like to say something about it, because I sort of have engaged with Anne Frank for such a long time, and I always wanted to play her, and I never did play her. First I was too young, then I was too old, and all the rest of it. But I was never really convinced about it, and I always thought it was extremely difficult to act someone like Anne Frank, and I thought it was a little too kitsch. And, with my students at the moment, I'm reading the
the real Anne Frank, they always have to interpret it and read it. And I realized how difficult it is to read this and not to think sentimentally, oh, this is a Jewish girl and she died, but rather to see her as a person who was alive, who loved people, who was cheeky, who had problems with her parents, and not to sort of stylize her as not a person somehow. And I didn't feel that way about the film Jakob. You know, whenever there was any kitsch, then it's this story with the fairy tale. But on the other hand, it does you good. I get a little annoyed with the film when I see it, but then I always think it's also nice for these viewers, you know, to see the girl and Misha and the clouds, and then at the end to have this cloud made of cotton batting. You know, I know there was a meaning for it. It was worth it. And then the sort of flashbacks that were very colorful. You know, I actually thought the coloring, the sort of artistic over-coloring of reality, which no longer was reality, and the reality that they're actually in that moment. And so I never had the feeling of kitsch or a feeling of sentimentality. And then, having watched it twice today, one thing that touched me very much was the death of the brother of Herschel, and the way that was acted. I mean, I should really say Müller-Stahl again. You know, I was looking at the way he acted as his brother when his brother was dead, and it's amazing. And I see that in all of the acting, this lack of sentimentality. Also in that scene when Kowalski dies, there too, again, no kitsch. And the grief was strong enough without it.
We're actually right in the middle of thank you, Blanche, right in the middle of a discussion of the aesthetic means of the film, which I think we've already said several times are very, very striking. Of course, the use of the fantastical and the comedic, those are also stylistic elements in the film, but overall, I mean, we have one question about the, as Sabine, you already mentioned, the Brechtchen, the haircuts. The question actually regarding the haircuts is whether these are part of a Brechtchen alienation strategy to emphasize the fantastical elements. We also have a question about the function of music. You know, whether any of you would like to comment on the function of music in the film. And Sabine, you mentioned the music in the Anne Frank film, the US TV film, which is overly sentimental. I mean, why is it for Bayer so important to disrupt kitsch, sentimentality? Can't one argue that these are important elements to draw people in emotionally, to make them care, not just about the story in the film, but about the Holocaust more generally? And isn't it, you know, that was the other question that we had. Isn't it a dangerous strategy that risks alienating people from the topic and creating something that is neutral and cold?
Well, I would say one factor we haven't mentioned is very, very important in understanding the aesthetic strategies in the film, and that is the influence of the new waves of the 1960s and 1970s. A number of DEFA directors, Bayer obviously among them, were very influenced by the kind of modernist perspective, the kind of rejection of classical narrative for more experimental forms of narrative that happened both in Western Europe, like the Nouvelle Vague in France, but also actually very strongly in the entire Eastern Bloc in Poland, think of Vaida, but also in Czechoslovakia and other countries. And there was a profound interest in exploring new narrative strategies that thematized narrative itself. And of course, if Jacob the Liar isn't a perfect example of that, I don't know. And so one could definitely look at other examples of new wave films of the period, totally unrelated to Holocaust representation, to consider the appeal of the unreliable narrator as a figure or a strategy in cinema. If I could just add like one tiny little intertextual reference, which is more frivolous than anything, but falls into that humorous category. DEFA was very, very famous, and still is, for its fairy tale films. And so the intertext I see here is to a popular DEFA film called Frau Holle. And Frau Holle is, of course, a Grimm's fairy tale where Frau Holle is a woman who shakes out the beds and clouds come out. And so the one scene with the princess and the clouds, that is straight out of a DEFA fairy tale film, complete with the really kind of pastel colors and that princess theme. So there is a little bit mockery to his fellow filmmakers in the film itself.
Yeah, no, and of course, Becker had written, not so much for the children's things, but he had written the short cabaret films, right? So he knew that vocabulary. Beyer, of course, was trained in Prague. And it was in Prague, of course, he got to know the actor who eventually wound up playing Jacob. I mean, this is a very complicated, I keep on saying that this is the most East German film that the East Germans made, which is the joke, because it is also the least East German film. But because it is the most, it sends up all the conventions, right? It sends up all the conventions. And the joke about Jacob is that when the novel was published, everybody said, by the way, the film answers this, that this is a Jewish narrator telling stories like Sholem Aleichem. Fiddler on the Roof had been shown in East Berlin, right? And so the notion that this was Jewish is Fiddler on the Roof, which is very not Jewish. But what is so fascinating, of course, and it really, for me, is intensely important, is that there was already a very, very important literature, we can call it oppositional, but belles lettres, Levin's Müller, which is one of the great novels by Johannes Bobowski, after or before Jörg Becker, I think the most important novelist to write about Jewish themes in the GDR, right? On a high level. This isn't sort of historical kitsch. This is serious literature. And Jacob and Levin's Müller, with the problem of the narrator, with the problem of historical distance, with the problem of double voices, is in a real sense the model for the fiction, and therefore also in an odd way for the film.
I have so many more questions, and we don't have that much more time left. One of the questions I do have is whether the film doesn't also in some way risk trivializing the Holocaust, in spite of all the really interesting and exciting things that you've just said. Maybe some more comments, questions we've had. Maybe I'll just sort of mention these to you. There's a comparison here with Life is Beautiful, which does similar things in terms of those Hollywood tropes where we have been trained to expect certain messages and then we don't get them. Also that judging from Beyer's earlier movies, he was not always above kitsch, but Jurek Becker consistently was. Also a thought here that Beyer had trained at Barrandov Studios in Czechoslovakia and was familiar with the new wave approaches, as just mentioned. So I think maybe because we have to wrap this up, I will ask you about sort of how the films, how you assess the comical elements of the film, Are these a trivialization, or is it more complex than that? And how did they translate into the Hollywood context and into Matthew Kathowitz's version of Jacob the Liar? If you do find the comical elements in Baez's film successful, how do you see that then translating into Kathowitz's film? I don't know, Blanche, I think you had some thoughts on Kathowitz's film because you have watched it as well, haven't you?
I'm sorry, you're going to have to say that in German again. Yeah, what do you think about the way the comical is translated from Frank Bayer's Jacob the Liar into the Hollywood film of Peter Kassovitz, which is also a comedy? Oh, you mean the American film? To be honest, I refused to watch it. You refused. I'm sorry to put it that bluntly, but I just didn't want to see it. Sorry. Could you say a bit more about that? Can you explain why you didn't want to see it? Yeah. Well, I saw a couple of the stills from that film, and I immediately thought, that's not my Jacob the Liar that I know from the book. And it's not got the aesthetics that I know from the book. Because I was comparing what Becker wrote in his novel, what was in the script and what was in the film, and I compared them all. And it was really coherent. And the scenes that we acted were ones that I found in Becker's book, and the way he describes it with this sort of background that's quite subtle humor, not very obvious humor. That was very articulate and subtle, and a humor that would just never got on my nerves. You know, there was one little scene, for example, with the radio that was broken, where Brash comes and says, well, I'd repair it. And then suddenly it's no longer necessary to repair it. It had already been fixed. You know, these were these little sort of funny things. Or Lena, the character of the little Lena. I mean, that's one of the most beautiful things in the film. This child who always asks, is it a lamp? No, is it a radio? You know, like that. Oh, sorry, my cat's coming into the picture. I do apologize. Yeah, be quiet, Nina. Stop meowing. All right. And, you know, this humor that was there right from the very beginning, I felt that just, you know, that's my scene with the snoring guy in the other side of the room, and how she wants the snoring guy back when he's gone because that's what she's used to. And that was this sort of subtle humor. And I felt the Hollywood film just didn't have it, and I didn't want to watch it. I'm sorry to be so impudent and say it as straight up as that, but
cheeky is good. Sabine, standing on one leg, what is the importance, what are the problems of humor in Frank Bayer's Jakob der Lügner, and how do these issues translate into the Hollywood version?
One of the truisms about the difference between tragedy and comedy, Aristotle, Shakespeare, is that tragedy deals with great people and great falls from great heights. Comedy deals with you and me, right? One of the things that strikes me about the power of Jacob, and by the way, of Bayer's Jacob, good God, not of Robin Williams's Jacob, and certainly not of Benigni's redoing of the theme, is that there is a kind of immediate identification with the, to use the lovely Yiddish word, the schlemiel at the center. Because in our hearts of hearts, we are all schlemiels. We wake up in the middle of the night knowing that somebody is going to reveal that. And we go back to sleep nevertheless. So I'm not worried about trivialization. Comedy never trivializes. Aristophanes does not trivialize. Shakespeare, remember, The Tempest is a comedy. Shakespeare does not trivialize. Shakespeare reveals, Aristophanes reveals what you and I experience, not what kings and nobles experiences.
Sabine.
What I would want to add to this is that we check our expectations. Partly this concerns all of historical film as a genre, but the Holocaust film with particular urgency. We want the master narrative. We want the one film that covers all angles and does justice to all of our demands, whether political, ethical, philosophical, aesthetic. And I think for a while we thought that Schindler's List was it. And the debates around Schindler's List reflected that. And just as kind of the very idea of narrative is problematized in the film, so perhaps do we have to understand that Holocaust films are kind of like parts of a mosaic. They can be incomplete and just show a snippet. And that snippet can be humor, or it can be almost like a chamber play, which Jacob the Liar also is. And I think there needs to be room also for something so quiet and subdued and something so brutal, a film that I really like a lot, Son of Saul, which is also a critique of Hollywood. And so it's not just the dominant master narrative that we want to have it all be explained to us. It is really a patchwork, a puzzle. And I think films that acknowledge that they're a piece of a puzzle are probably more productive or more satisfying in the end.
Thank you. It's especially nice to hear you mention Laszlo Nemes's Son of Saul, because we had Laszlo Nemes here in the spot last year as the Bogdanov Lecturer in Holocaust Studies for Holocaust Memorial Day at Manchester University with a Q&A. So I think this is a great way of wrapping up our discussion. I thank you very, very much for this really wonderful, exciting discussion. Thank you for joining us. Thank you to the audience for coming along. I look forward to seeing the panelists in the virtual green room. Please check the chat for some instructions. It would be nice to have the opportunity to speak a few more words before signing off. Thanks very much to everyone, and hope to see you. Good night.